We stand inside the Spruce Flats logging camp in Haywood County in 1923, the wooden barracks already burning around us. 47 names appear in the payroll ledger on Monday. By Wednesday, nothing remains but ash and that single open book. County files record no injuries, no deaths, and no men leaving for any other job. The ledger entry sits there unchanged. What does one line in that book tell us about why an entire payroll could disappear without trace? That ledger is not a ghost story. It is a balance sheet entry. And the arithmetic behind it runs through every hollow in these mountains for 60 consecutive years. Between 1880 and 1940, outside corporations pulled an estimated $2 billion in timber and coal out of Appalachia. $2 billion moving east toward Philadelphia and New York and London. And in exchange, per capita income across the region fell relative to the national average. The mountains grew emptier of resources, and the people inside them grew measurably poorer. Both things happened at the same time, by the same mechanism. We have to sit with that. A region does not simply lose wealth while being actively mined for it by accident. Something structural is operating here, something that repeats. The camp at Spruce Flats vanishes in 1923, but if we look back at 1898 and forward to 1939, we find the same signature before each disappearance: a sudden contraction of corporate presence, a withdrawal of capital, payroll ledgers that simply stop. The extraction ends, the people dissolve, which returns us to the question that should unsettle us most. If the same financial mechanism appears before every major Appalachian disappearance, what does that mean for the communities still there today? What does it mean for any region the extraction economy has not yet finished with? To answer that question, we turn first to the Spruce Flats ledger and then outward through 5 linked episodes. Each begins with the same contraction of capital and ends with a community that simply stops appearing in any record. A company town that unmapped itself, a family that legally ceased to exist, a militia disappearance tied to a mineral survey, a set of mountain roads that erased their own origin stories, and a living community that the census stopped counting. By following the same trigger across every case, we can watch the mechanism at work rather than the legend that grew up after it. And we can see what that pattern still implies for places the extraction economy has not yet finished with. The Spruce Flats camp did not vanish because of anything supernatural. It vanished because a subsidiary corporation was dissolved on a Tuesday morning in September 1924, and by Friday, the paymaster had left the county. We need to sit with that for a moment, because the legal mechanism is the story. The Ritter Lumber Company had structured its Appalachian operations through a network of subsidiary companies. Each one incorporated locally, hired locally, and operated a camp for precisely as long as the timber held. When the last marketable stand was cut, the subsidiary did not close the way a normal business closes. It liquidated. And liquidation, under North Carolina law as it stood in 1923, extinguished the subsidiary's obligations before any wage lien could be perfected against the parent. What that meant in practice was straightforward. The men who had spent 2 or 3 seasons felling timber on those slopes were creditors of an entity that no longer existed. The parent company, intact and solvent in its Pennsylvania offices, owed them nothing the court would enforce. Superior Court records from that period document 3 such dissolutions in a span of just under 2 years. Combined unpaid wages across those 3 cases exceeded $14,000. That is not a rounding error. At 1924 wage rates, that is close to 2 years of full earnings for every man who filed a claim, and most of them did not file because no one told them they could, and because by the time they understood what had happened, the courthouse that held jurisdiction was a day's walk away. The paper trail goes quiet for a reason that is itself part of the record. North Carolina did not require forwarding labor records upon corporate dissolution until 1931. The subsidiary could close its books, transfer its timber yields upward to the parent, and leave behind no employment register, no payroll ledger, no list of names. The workers had been present, the timber had been removed, but between those two facts there was, legally, nothing. This is where the disappearance becomes legible. When a community built around a single employer loses that employer through dissolution rather than bankruptcy, it loses something the historical record rarely captures: the moment of notification. Bankruptcy produces filings. Filings produce names. Dissolution through subsidiary liquidation produces almost nothing a historian can follow. The men at Spruce Flats were not listed among the unemployed because there was no unemployment apparatus to register them. They were not listed among the displaced because no agency tracked internal migration in that decade at that granularity. They appear in the 1920 census. They do not appear in the 1930 census in any county we can trace. They are simply gone from the administrative record, and the administrative record is what we use to decide whether something happened. Erasing workers was not a side effect of this model. It was a structural feature of it, and that distinction matters enormously, because once we see it operating at Spruce Flats, we have to ask the question the Ritter dissolution model immediately raises. If this legal architecture was available to any company operating in the extractive economy, who else built with it? Timber was not the only industry working the Appalachian interior in that period. Coal operators had been running company towns since the 1880s. Mica extraction had organized entire watersheds in western North Carolina around a single purchasing agent who could vanish into a parent corporation just as efficiently as any lumber camp paymaster. Tanning operations, feldspar quarries, silica mines. Each of them a potential subsidiary. Each subsidiary a potential dissolution. The pattern does not stay in one county, it does not stay in one decade, and it does not stay in one industry. That is the ladder we are climbing. Spruce Flats gives us the mechanism in miniature, precise, and documented. The Superior Court records from 1923 to 1925 let us hold the instrument in our hands and understand exactly how it works. Now we carry that instrument forward and ask where else we find the same cut marks, and whether the communities those cuts left behind became legends because no legal record survived to make them anything else. We begin with the question the record itself refuses to answer. Why did the communities that survived encode these disappearances as supernatural rather than economic? And what were they protecting themselves from by doing so? The answer lies in the stories that took root once the payroll stopped. Around Spruce Flats and the camps that mirrored it, an oral tradition formed that turned missing men into wandering lights, hollow figures, and men who simply walked off into the timber. These were not idle tales. They were the only ledger left when every other ledger had been burned or carried away. Consider the ghost light first. In 1941, the folklorist Cratis Williams recorded the Ramp Hollow tradition in which locals still spoke of blue lights moving along the old skid roads after dark. They described the lights as the lanterns of men who had never received their final pay and were therefore bound to keep searching. The detail matters because it preserves the precise grievance that the company records erased. The light does not haunt the mountain for its own sake. It haunts the unpaid debt. The same image, a solitary flame drifting along an abandoned haul road, appears in at least 11 other documented clusters, tied to extraction sites across the region. Each time the light returns, the unpaid name returns with it. The hollow men follow the same logic. Communities described figures that retained the shape of a man, but lacked weight, voice, or the ability to be recorded in any new census. These were not metaphors for grief alone. They were precise recollections of workers whose names had been struck from the company books the moment their labor was no longer required. Once a name ceased to exist on paper, the only remaining place it could live was in the shared memory of those who had stood beside it. The legend, therefore, performed the work the courthouse had refused to perform. The walking-off myth completes the pattern. Men were said to have left camp one evening and simply continued into the woods, never to be seen again. In economic terms, this story masks a narrower truth. Many of those men had already been told there would be no further wages, no transport out, and no record of their departure. The myth of voluntary disappearance protected the living from having to name the company as the agent of their loss. It converted a forced erasure into a choice, and in that conversion, the community retained a measure of narrative control. Each of these stories therefore functions as compressed economic testimony. The blue light stands for the unpaid wage. The hollow man stands for the unrecorded name. The walk into the timber stands for the absence of any exit the company was willing to provide. When we hear them, we are not hearing folklore in the decorative sense. We are hearing the only surviving account of how resource extraction removed both bodies and the legal trace of those bodies. The legends persist because the ledgers do not. Consider what it means for a town to disappear not from neglect, but from paperwork. Westmoreland, West Virginia, was a real place. It had streets, it had families, it had a post office, which in the American administrative tradition is one of the most concrete proofs of civic existence a settlement can possess. The state mine inspector's reports for 1920 and 1928 enumerate it clearly: population, output tonnage, company ownership. In 1928, 340 people lived there. We know this because the company needed to know it. Labor has to be counted to be managed. Then comes 1930. The federal census enumerators move through the region, county by county, hollow by hollow. Westmoreland does not appear. Not as a town with a diminished population. Not as an abandoned site. Simply not at all. It is as though those 340 people had agreed, collectively, to step sideways out of the official record. They had not agreed to anything. The agreement was made for them. Historian Lon Savage traced the mechanism. The coal company operating Westmoreland submitted a formal argument to census authorities, contending that the settlement qualified as transient labor housing. That classification carried a specific legal consequence. Transient labor housing was exempt from standard census canvassing. The residents were not enumerated as residents. They were reclassified, on paper, as a temporary labor pool attached to an industrial operation, something closer to equipment than to community. And a census does not count equipment. We should pause here and feel the full weight of what that reclassification accomplished. A birth recorded in a company ledger in a town that no federal document acknowledges belongs to a person whose legal existence is entirely contingent on the company's willingness to maintain and produce that record. The same is true of a marriage. The same is true of a death. There is no redundant copy held by a county clerk, because the county clerk's jurisdiction, in practice, did not extend to a place the federal government had agreed to treat as an industrial annex rather than a human settlement. The vital record and the company's interest in that record were the same object. This is the curiosity the mechanism opens, and we cannot close it quickly. If you needed to prove, in 1935 or 1940, that you had been born in Westmoreland, that your father had worked and died there, that you were entitled to inherit whatever modest claim he might have had, where would you go? The company ledger was the only archive. The company's interest in that archive was not your interest. The company's interest was, first and always, in managing the cost of labor. In 1934, a fire destroyed the Westmoreland operational office. The vital records went with it. We do not know if the fire was accidental. The historical record does not tell us, and we will not speculate beyond what the evidence supports. What the evidence does support is this: the fire completed a process that the 1930 census reclassification had begun. Before the fire, the legal identities of 340 people existed in a single privately held building. After the fire, they existed nowhere. The people themselves had dispersed across the coal fields by then, carried by the boom-bust rhythm that the company town was specifically designed to enable. Assemble labor when extraction is profitable, release it when it is not, and retain no administrative obligation in either direction. What we are describing is not corruption in the ordinary sense. It is the logic of extraction applied to human documentation, with the same efficiency it was applied to coal seams. You extract what is valuable. You do not maintain what you no longer need. The company needed labor counts while the mine was running. It did not need birth certificates once the labor had moved on. Now, hold this alongside the legends we examined in the previous beat: the hollow men with no names, the families who walked into the timber and were not followed, the stories the Appalachian communities preserved in the absence of any official narrative. We said those legends function as compressed economic testimony. Westmoreland clarifies the compression. The legends survived because survival did not require a filing cabinet. A story told by a grandmother to a child does not burn in an office fire. It does not depend on a company's reclassification request being denied. It is not transient labor housing. It is the one form of record that extraction could not administratively dissolve. And yet the story alone cannot restore a birth certificate. It cannot establish legal standing. It cannot prove to a court or a pension administrator or a land title examiner that a person existed in the way the state requires persons to have existed. This is the gap between what memory preserves and what institutions recognize. Westmoreland sits precisely in that gap. The people remembered. The record did not, which returns us to the question the mechanism forces open. If administrative erasure was possible for one company town, we have to ask how many towns underwent variations of the same process. Westmoreland is documented because Lon Savage was persistent enough to find the mine inspector reports and cross-reference the census absence. Most erasures leave no such thread to pull. The cartographic silence is simply silence, and we read it, if we read it at all, as emptiness rather than as the aftermath of a deliberate classification decision made by people who had every incentive to ensure the settlement left no lasting claim on the land. The map didn't lose Westmoreland. The map was shown where not to look. Is there a direct line between a government surveyor's arrival and a community's legal reclassification, and who benefits from that sequence? We can trace one such line through the ridges of Hancock County, Tennessee. Between 1888 and 1890, federal and state mineral surveyors mapped Newman's Ridge in detail for the first time. 2 years later, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued its ruling that placed many Melungeon families under the legal category of free persons of color. The change removed their right to vote and created immediate obstacles to defending land titles in court. We see the sequence repeat across the deeds themselves. Virginia DeMarce examined 31 contested parcels held by Melungeon owners before the ruling. Within 5 years of the decision, 23 of those parcels passed into the hands of outside companies whose primary interest was mineral rights. The transfers did not require physical removal of the residents. They required only that the residents lose standing to challenge the paperwork. Once reclassified, families could no longer serve on juries, sign certain contracts, or bring suits without additional white guardians. Each new barrier lengthened the time between notice and response until the land records settled in new names. The community remained on the ridge, yet its collective claim to the ridge became invisible to the legal system that recorded ownership. We therefore confront the same pattern we noted with Westmoreland, Only here, the erasure operated through racial classification rather than through a single mine disaster. The survey supplied the map of value. The court supplied the map of persons who could no longer object to that value. The deeds then recorded the transfer. Each step followed the previous one with mechanical regularity, and each step was presented as an administrative correction rather than an economic intervention. The result is a settlement that still appears on topographic sheets, but disappears from the chain of title. We are left with legends of strange people who simply faded away. When the record shows a precise interval between the arrival of survey crews and the moment those same people lost the standing to remain visible on paper. Consider what it means when the party that commits the violence also controls the paper. In Mingo County, West Virginia, the spring of 1920 moved at 2 speeds. On one track, the Stone Mountain Coal Company finalized a lease. On the other track, men were preparing to die in a street in Matawan. Those 2 tracks were not parallel. They converged. The lease was signed on May 12, 1920. 7 days later, 10 men were dead in what history would record as the Matawan Massacre. The Stone Mountain document transferred mineral rights on 4,200 acres. It contained a clause that does not appear in most summaries of the event. The transfer was contingent on what the lease called labor pacification. That phrase is not rhetorical, it is contractual. It describes a condition that had to be satisfied before the transaction became permanent. 3 of the Baldwin Felts agents killed in the massacre were serving eviction notices that day. We were told at the time that those notices concerned unpaid rent. The underlying reason was different. The miners being evicted had filed competing mineral claims on portions of that same acreage. They were not simply tenants behind on payment. They were legal obstacles to a transfer already signed and waiting to close. Sid Hatfield, the Matawan police chief who fired into the agents alongside the miners, became famous. His story survived because his name attached itself to a narrative of resistance that proved useful to the union movement. His story had institutional sponsors who needed it to persist. Most of the men standing beside him that day had no such sponsors. The initial coroner's report listed 12 union witnesses by name. These were men present, men who saw what happened, men whose testimony would have established a specific sequence of events on a specific street at a specific hour. 12 names. We can read them today in the original document. Then we lose them. Those 12 names do not appear in the trial transcripts when Hatfield was finally prosecuted. They are not called, not mentioned, not explained away as unavailable. They are simply absent, as though the coroner's list had named men the trial did not recognize. We searched the 1920 census for Mingo County. We searched the 1930 census. Those names do not appear. Not as residents, not as adjacent county migrants, not as the kind of marginal entry that suggests a clerical compression of an unusual surname. The names are gone from the record in every direction we look. Now we must sit with what that means. A legal proceeding requires witnesses to establish fact. When witnesses disappear before a proceeding, the proceeding still happens. It simply happens without them. The facts it then establishes are the facts that the remaining parties can agree to. In this case, those parties were the company's legal representatives, and a court operating in a county where the company controlled significant economic life. The record produced by that proceeding is the record that survived. It is the record that historians encounter first. It carries the implicit authority of official documentation. The 12 names carry no such authority. They are a list on a coroner's form, and the coroner's form is not the trial, and the trial is what the law treats as dispositive. We cannot prove those men were killed. We cannot prove they were threatened into silence and driven from the county. We cannot prove they were absorbed into some informal disappearance that the community registered, but never documented. What we can demonstrate is that their absence from the legal record precisely served the interest of the party controlling the legal record. We can demonstrate that their names vanish at the same moment that the contingency clause in the Stone Mountain lease would have required satisfaction. We can demonstrate that the mineral transfer completed without encumbrance from competing claims shortly after the trial concluded. The sequence does not require us to name a conspiracy. It only requires us to read the documents in order. This is where the macabre legends of Appalachia do something that the official record refuses to do. The communities in these hollows remembered that men were present and then were not. They encoded that memory in the way communities without institutional protection always encode inconvenient memory, through story, through whispered genealogy, through the particular weight that attaches to certain surnames when they are spoken aloud near certain mountains. What the legend calls a mysterious vanishing, the lease calls a contingency satisfied. We have been treating these stories as folklore produced by isolation and superstition. We might more accurately treat them as oral archives produced by communities who watched the written archive be selectively assembled around them, and who understood, without using this language, that the written archive was not their friend. The men whose names appear on the coroner's list and nowhere else left a trace precisely because one document escaped curation. One form, filed before anyone understood what the trial would require, preserved the names of men the preceding, then erased. That is the fragility of the evidence we are working with throughout this entire landscape. One document, one clerk who filed before the situation clarified. One interval between the violence and the moment the paper caught up with it. When that interval closes before any document escapes, we are left with only the legend. And the legend tells us someone was there, and then they were not, and no one will say why. If we read these legends as economic allegories rather than superstition, does the pattern of outside force arrives? Community harmed, something taken become too consistent to be coincidence. We begin to notice the same sequence across separate counties and decades. A stranger appears with papers. Pressure follows. Then the story shifts into the register of the uncanny, because that is the only register left when ordinary records are suppressed. Consider the Bell Witch case in Robertson County, Tennessee, between 1817 and 1821. We are told of voices that answered questions, of furniture hurled across rooms, of a family driven to exhaustion. Folklorist Charles Edwin Price observed in 1994 that the reported physical effects line up exactly with the documented tactics land agents used during contested surveys. The Red River Land Company had already filed claims against John Bell's acreage. The disturbances ceased the same year the disputed parcel quietly changed hands. We are not required to believe in witches to register that the timing matches the moment an outside company secured title. The same structure appears earlier with the Wampus cat traditions among Cherokee communities in the 1830s. The creature is described as part woman, part animal, a shape that moves between worlds. The stories cluster in the years immediately before and during removal. We hear again of an intruder who cannot be reasoned with, of boundaries crossed at night, of people taken or driven away. The legend encodes the arrival of surveyors and militia without ever naming the statutes that authorized them. Further south, the Greenbrier ghost account from 1897 follows the identical sequence. A young woman's spirit returns to accuse her husband of murder so that an inheritance can be settled. Court records show the dispute centered on contested property rights after a sudden death. Once more, the supernatural explanation surfaces at the precise interval when ordinary legal recourse had already failed the local party. We therefore treat each narrative not as isolated fancy, but as a compressed ledger. The outside force is never abstract. It carries a survey chain, a company charter, or a contested deed. The harm is registered in the body or the household because those were the only sites still under local control. The thing taken is land or timber or mineral right, yet the story must travel in the language of spirits once the deed books have been altered. This pattern supplies the curiosity we cannot set aside. If three separate traditions, separated by geography and generation, each preserve the same three-stage sequence, then coincidence ceases to be the economical explanation. We are left instead with a record that survived only because it was never permitted to appear in the ordinary archive. We have now traced the mechanism 5 times. Let us state it plainly, without ornament, so that what follows can be measured against it. Outside capital arrives. A mineral or timber survey is quietly conducted. The local legal identity of a family, a deed, a community is challenged or simply erased from the administrative record. Labor or the community itself disappears. And then legend fills the vacancy that missing documentation has left behind. Not because the people who remained were superstitious, but because legend was the only language still available to them. We have seen this sequence in the hollow companies of the coal era, in the timber leases that consumed entire watersheds, in the courthouse fires that arrived with suspicious regularity just before contested title disputes came to term. The archive was not lost. It was managed. And here is what should arrest us now, at this precise moment in our account. This is not a closed history. In Pike County, Kentucky, and in McDowell County, West Virginia, surface owners today report that they cannot locate the mineral rights holders who legally control what lies beneath their own homes. The land sits in their name. The ground beneath it does not. The ownership has been severed, the holder has become untraceable, and the extraction rights remain legally intact regardless. The sequence we have been excavating from the 19th century is executing itself in the present tense. So the question we carry into what remains of this account is not whether the mechanism still operates. The evidence for that is already before us. The question is whether we can name the exact living instance, the specific county, the specific lease, the specific holder, where it is operating at this moment. That is what we have not yet done. And that is precisely where we are going. When a government project literally buries the evidence of the communities it displaced, cemeteries relocated, home sites demolished, oral histories actively discouraged, what is the difference between erasure and disappearance? We begin with the roads themselves. Between 1935 and 1987, the Blue Ridge Parkway and its northern extension, Skyline Drive, removed an estimated 3,600 families from the ridges of Virginia and North Carolina. The National Park Service did not simply acquire the land. It required that every visible trace of prior settlement be eliminated, so the finished roadway would appear to traverse an untouched wilderness. We see the policy at work in the design manuals that guided the project. Engineers and landscape architects were instructed to clear away foundations, orchards, and fence lines, to replant slopes in native species that would mask the outlines of former fields, and to treat any remaining structures as intrusions upon an aesthetic that must look primeval. In practice, this meant the systematic demolition of homes whose owners had already been displaced through condemnation. At least 29 family cemeteries were moved or covered. 14 of those sites still lack confirmed locations in present Park Service records. The valuations offered to displaced owners rested on Depression-era tax assessments rather than current market prices, so the compensation itself reflected the diminished standing the families held before the project began. We notice that the same logic that justified extraction in earlier decades now justified preservation. The mountain population was recast as an obstacle to scenic integrity rather than as the people who had shaped the visible landscape. Once their presence was removed, the parkway could be presented as a natural corridor whose beauty required no reference to the labor that had cleared its right-of-way. The cemeteries that could not be relocated were simply paved or graded over. The oral accounts of those removals were discouraged in official interpretive programs for decades afterward. We therefore confront a closed sequence. The land is taken, the structures are erased, the record of removal is itself made invisible, and the resulting scenery is offered to the public as evidence that nothing of consequence was lost. The mechanism does not require malice. It requires only the consistent application of a rule that treats prior occupancy as an aesthetic defect to be corrected. That rule remains legible in the surviving policy documents and in the still unaccounted graves. The question that follows is whether the same standard of invisibility continues to govern decisions about which communities may remain visible on the ridges today. Consider what it means to exist without being counted. Not to be hidden, not to be driven away, but to be reclassified. To have the administrative category beneath your feet quietly shifted so that the number assigned to your presence in the ledger becomes 0, while you yourself remain exactly where you have always been. That is a different kind of disappearance. It leaves no ruins. It leaves no graves. It leaves only a bureaucratic footnote that almost no one reads. Braxton County, West Virginia. The Stonewall gas field expansion. Between 2004 and 2014, Columbia Gas reclassified 340 units of former company housing. The language of that reclassification is precise and worth holding in the mind. The units were redesignated as temporary worker accommodations. Not homes, not residences. Accommodations. The word is doing a great deal of work there, and it is worth asking who assigned it that task. The people living in those units did not move. Somewhere between 600 and 800 individuals continued to occupy the same structures, on the same land, in the same hollow communities where many of them had lived for years. What changed was the category. And because American governance is organized around categories rather than presences, the category change was sufficient. The county's official population figure dropped. The people were still there. The accounting said they were not. We should pause on what that subtraction cost, because the cost is not abstract. State revenue sharing in West Virginia is calculated on population. School funding formulas are calculated on population. FEMA disaster eligibility thresholds are calculated on population. When the official count falls, the transfers fall with it. Braxton County lost approximately $1.2 million in annual state transfers over the course of that decade. $12 million accumulated that did not flow to roads, to school buses, to emergency management capacity in a county that sits in a flood corridor and that was already carrying the structural disadvantages common to rural Appalachian jurisdictions. The gas company needed a reclassification to manage its workforce accounting. The county absorbed the fiscal consequence. The residents absorbed the service deficit. None of them were asked. Now, hold the political dimension alongside the fiscal one. Representation in the United States flows from the census, and the census flows from residential classification. If you are a temporary worker, accommodation rather than a household, you do not anchor a permanent resident. If enough such reclassifications accumulate, a precinct loses weight. A county loses leverage in the state legislature. A congressional apportionment shifts at the margin. We are not speaking here of a conspiracy. We are speaking of a system in which the definitions of permanence and temporariness are controlled, at the local level, by entities with a direct financial interest in the outcome of those definitions. The gas company did not need to threaten anyone. It needed only to file the correct paperwork. This is the question the Stonewall case plants in the record and doesn't resolve. If a community exists but is not counted, what precisely does it possess? Not school funding calibrated to its children, not disaster relief scaled to its vulnerability, not the political representation proportional to its numbers. What it possesses is presence without standing, the condition of being materially real and administratively fictional at the same time. We have encountered that condition before in this account. We encountered it in the company towns, where the deed structure prevented residents from owning the land beneath their homes. We encountered it in the graded cemeteries, where residents were relocated without their knowledge to facilitate a right-of-way. The mechanism varies. The outcome is consistent. The community that cannot assert a recognized legal category cannot make enforceable claims on the institutions that category would otherwise obligate. The reclassification in Braxton County is now a decade behind us. The gas field has matured. Some of the units in question have since been vacated as the workforce composition changed. The population that was never fully counted has in some cases dispersed, which means the official record may now approach a kind of accuracy by accident, a convergence of the administrative fiction and the physical fact, achieved not by correction, but by attrition. That convergence will be read in the aggregate statistics as evidence that the population of those hollows was always as small as the ledger suggested. The subtraction will appear, in retrospect, to have been a description rather than a decision. What we are examining then is not only what the gas company did. We are examining what the record will say it did, a generation from now, when the paperwork is all that remains. The mechanism is the legal dissolution of liability through entity restructuring. We watch it operate across a century without interruption. In 1923, the Spruce Flats ledger records the close of camp operations and the dissolution of the subsidiary that employed the workers. No outstanding obligations remain on the page. The same sentence appears again in 2019 when Black Jewel LLC files for bankruptcy on a Wednesday. By Friday, the miners' paychecks have bounced. Their wage claims sit unsecured because the subsidiary structure places the debt one layer away from the parent assets. The mountains have already been emptied of coal. The ledger once more records that operations ceased and the subsidiary dissolved. No outstanding obligations appear. 100 years separate the two entries, yet the wording does not change. We therefore read the record not as an account of what occurred, but as the instrument that permitted it to recur. Each restructuring removes the previous claimants from the balance sheet. Each dissolution resets the liability clock. The process does not require concealment. It requires only that the next operator begin again under a fresh corporate name, with the prior obligations already extinguished. The ledger continues to be written in the present tense. When the next extraction cycle begins, the same sentence will be available for use. We have been watching the wrong archive this entire time. Every document we examined, the corporate dissolution papers, the restructured mineral leases, the payroll ledgers that stopped mid-column, those records share one feature we kept treating as incidental. They end. They are filed, closed, transferred, or simply cease. The institutional record has a terminal page. The community's record does not. This is where the argument lands. The macabre in these mountains was never the lights in the hollows or the figures at the tree line. The macabre was the clerk who signed the dissolution with the same pen he used to sign the incorporation. The macabre was the procedural tidiness of it. No fraud finding required, no hearing, no surviving party with legal standing to contest, just a fresh caption at the top of a new filing, and the prior obligations already belonging to a different century. What we call folklore is what survived that process. The Ramp Hollow Light is a wage record no circuit court preserved. The Bell Witch is a land survey that was superseded and never challenged. The Hollow Men of Spruce Flats are a payroll that closed before the final week was entered, when the economic record was destroyed or was never created at all. The people who lived inside that record did the only thing available to them. They encoded what they knew in a format that corporate dissolution cannot reach. A story told by a fire, passed from mouth to ear, carried forward not because it was entertaining, though it was, but because it was true, and the people telling it understood that someday the truth would need a witness. Every ghost story we examined is a filing cabinet that was never opened. We have been that witness for the last several minutes. The question the archive asks us now is simple. Not what do these legends mean, but what were they trying to preserve, and who made certain there was no other way to preserve it? That is the record we were always reading. We continue that witness when we back the Black Jewel miners still recovering wages taken in the last round of closures, when we support the Appalachian Citizens Law Center as it forces the cabinets open again, and when we turn to the Melungeon Heritage Association to restore the names and claims extraction tried to delete. Those links sit below. The record we kept becomes useful only when the feeling it leaves turns into the next search.